The cabin of Flight 417 hummed with the familiar energy of a long-haul trip. Businessmen adjusted their ties, families wrestled with carry-ons, and the soft clinking of glasses in first class added a luxurious undertone to the air. Among the passengers settling into their seats was Barron Trump, a 17-year-old traveling alone for a personal engagement. Tall, polite, and reserved, he adjusted his seatbelt and glanced through the in-flight menu, mentally preparing for the hours ahead. Then, a quiet murmur swept through the cabin. Heads turned, whispers spread like ripples in water. Even the flight attendants subtly straightened their postures. A billionaire had just stepped onto the plane. Not just any billionaire, Richard Alden, one of the most influential business magnates in America. With a fortune built across tech, finance, and media, Alden was a name that commanded attention in every room he entered. His presence alone carried a silent authority. Even at 82 years old, he moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who had shaped industries and redefined success. But something was off. As the flight attendant checked his ticket, an uneasy expression crossed her face. She quickly turned to her colleague, whispering in hushed tones. Within moments, it became clear. There had been a mix-up. Due to an airline error, first class was overbooked, and Richard Alden had been bumped to economy. Passengers exchanged glances. A billionaire in economy? It was almost unthinkable. The flight attendant scrambled, trying to find a solution, but there were no open seats in first class. A few murmured apologies, but the reality was unavoidable. Richard Alden, the man who could buy a fleet of private jets, was going to have to squeeze into a cramped coach seat. Barron, watching the situation unfold, felt a sudden pull of instinct. He had been raised to believe in respect, not just for power and wealth, but for experience. And here was Richard Alden, a man who had built empires, standing in the aisle, waiting for a resolution that wasn't coming. Without hesitation, Barron Trump stood up. "Mr. Alden, please take my seat, I insist." The air in the cabin shifted. All eyes were now on the teenager. Alden paused, studying the young man before him. His deep-set eyes, wise with decades of navigating the unpredictable tides of business and life, flickered with something close to surprise. In his world, transactions were calculated, negotiations were ruthless, and generosity was often just another strategy. But this was pure kindness. "Son, are you sure about this?" Alden asked, his voice carrying both curiosity and respect. Barron nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely." For a moment, Alden just looked at him. A lifetime of boardroom battles had sharpened his ability to read people, and in Barron's face he saw no hidden agenda, no expectation of recognition, just sincerity. Slowly, Alden nodded. "All right, kid, I appreciate it." The shift was immediate. Passengers exchanged stunned glances, whispering among themselves. Flight attendants, momentarily caught off guard, exchanged silent expressions of admiration. Even those who had barely noticed Barron before were now impressed by his selflessness. As Alden lowered himself into Barron's plush first-class seat, he let out a quiet sigh, part exhaustion, part amusement. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, adjusting to the unexpected comfort. "I wanted to," Barron replied simply, offering a small smile before disappearing into the economy section. The contrast between first class and economy. The shift from first-class luxury to economy's cramped reality was immediate. Barron found himself wedged between a talkative salesman and a crying toddler. The space was tight, the noise level higher, and the atmosphere worlds apart from the calm exclusivity of the seat he had just given up. But he didn't seem to mind. He simply popped in his headphones, leaned back, and let the hum of the plane carry him away. Meanwhile, back in first class, Richard Alden sat in silence, staring out the window, but his mind was elsewhere. A lifetime in business had made him skeptical of grand gestures. In his world, favors always came with strings attached. But this was different. He reached into the leather-bound notebook he always carried, a habit from years of strategizing, planning, and sketching out ideas. His fingers hesitated for a moment before he began jotting down thoughts. Why had the boy's kindness struck him this way? Was it because it had been so long since he'd seen an act of genuine generosity? Or was it because, despite all the billions, the power, and the influence, a 17-year-old had just reminded him of something far more valuable? Something about this moment lingered, a spark. Alden wasn't sure what it was just yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And then turbulence struck. 1 hour into the flight, the cabin lights flickered. The seatbelt sign blinked on. The plane jolted violently, sending trays sliding and drinks spilling. A few gasps echoed through the cabin. The calm murmur of conversation vanished, replaced by the anxious silence that only comes when people suddenly remember how small they are at 3,5,000 feet. In first class, Alden's knuckles tightened around the armrests. Despite all the turbulence he had faced in life, financial collapses, high-stakes mergers, and political battles, this felt different. He found himself glancing back to where Barron Trump now sat, somewhere in the economy cabin, enduring the same storm, but in far less comfort. The realization hit him harder than he expected. And just like that, the paths of two men, one at the height of success, the other just beginning his journey, were suddenly woven together, in ways neither of them could yet understand. This was just the beginning. The low hum of the aircraft had become unsettlingly inconsistent. One moment the flight was smooth and peaceful. The next, the entire plane lurched violently to one side. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and a tense voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence due to a storm system. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." A wave of unease rippled through the cabin. The familiar sounds of casual conversation, clinking glasses and pages turning had vanished, replaced by hushed prayers, the nervous tapping of fingers against armrests, and the occasional gasp as the plane shuddered under the weight of the storm. Barron Trump, now sitting in a cramped middle seat in economy, instinctively tightened his seatbelt. The contrast between first-class luxury and coach discomfort had never been more apparent. The seats were narrower, the legroom minimal, and now, with the turbulence intensifying, the reality of being in the back of the plane made itself clear. To his left, a young mother clutched her crying toddler, gently rocking her back and forth. Across the aisle, a businessman who had been overly chatty earlier now sat stone-faced, his grip tight on the armrests. Barron, however, remained calm. He had been on turbulent flights before, but something about this one felt different. Not just because of the storm, but because of what had led him here. Meanwhile, in first class, Richard Alden, still seated in Barron's former first-class seat, exhaled slowly, his hands resting on the plush leather armrests. The billionaire had spent a lifetime mastering control. Controlling markets, controlling negotiations, controlling outcomes. But here, in the middle of a raging storm at 3,5,000 feet, he realized there were still things he could not control. Another sudden jolt rocked the plane, sending a drink spilling off a nearby tray table. Flight attendants moved quickly, their professional smiles hiding their own apprehension. But Alden barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. He turned his head slightly, eyes drifting toward the drawn curtain that separated first class from the rest of the passengers. Barron Trump was back there. The kid had given up this comfort, this sense of security, without hesitation. Not for attention, not for reward, just because it was the right thing to do. Alden had met countless men in his lifetime, CEOs, politicians, world leaders, but very few would have done what that boy had just done. The turbulence had finally begun to subside. The violent shaking that had rattled the plane, spilling drinks and turning whispers into nervous prayers, had settled into a steady hum. A fragile sense of calm returned, but the air in the cabin still carried an unshakable tension, as if the passengers weren't yet convinced that the worst was over. Richard Alden exhaled, loosening his grip on the armrests of the first-class seat that wasn't originally his. Despite his decades of experience navigating the unpredictable storms of business, the helplessness he had just felt was unlike anything he was used to. And yet, his thoughts weren't on himself. His mind was on the boy who had given up this seat without hesitation. Alden wasn't a man who lingered on sentimental gestures. He had built his empire through strategy, logic, and an unwavering focus on the bottom line. But for some reason, this simple act of generosity stuck with him. Without a second thought, he stood up. The moment Alden rose from his seat, a few heads turned in mild confusion. First-class passengers weren't the type to aimlessly wander mid-flight, and flight attendants were already moving toward him, ready to politely remind him that it was best to remain seated. But Alden wasn't concerned about protocol. Ignoring the curious glances, he walked past the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. The transition was stark. First class was an oasis of space and silence. Plush leather seats, warm towels, personalized service. But as soon as Alden stepped into economy, the reality of standard air travel surrounded him. The seats were cramped, tray tables barely had room to fold down, and there was a distinct lack of legroom that first-class passengers never had to think about. The hum of quiet conversation returned, but now there was an unspoken energy in the air. A realization that something unusual was happening, because one of the wealthiest men in America had just voluntarily stepped into economy class. Alden walked down the narrow aisle, his polished shoes softly tapping against the floor. He scanned the rows until he found what he was looking for. There, seated in the middle seat, was Barron Trump, his former first-class seat now occupied by Alden himself. The young man had his headphones in, his posture relaxed but upright, his expression unreadable. Despite the tight, uncomfortable space, he didn't seem to mind where he was. He looked completely at ease. Alden nodded to himself. Interesting. Clearing his throat slightly, he finally spoke. Mind if I sit here for a while? Barron blinked, surprised to find the billionaire he had just given up his seat for now standing beside him. Of course not, Mr. Alden. A few passengers nearby subtly leaned in, pretending not to listen, but in reality, they hung on to every word. How often did someone witness one of the world's richest men choosing to sit in coach? Alden lowered himself into the cramped seat, adjusting to the lack of space. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. It's been a long time since I've sat in a middle seat. Barron smiled, leaning slightly toward him. Not as bad as people think, huh? Alden smirked. That depends on how long the flight is. He studied Barron for a moment before speaking again. You didn't have to do that back there. Barron simply shrugged. It felt like the right thing to do. Alden tilted his head. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, analyzed market trends, and played chess with the most powerful minds in the world. He knew when someone was calculating their moves. But looking at Barron, he didn't see an angle. He saw genuine sincerity. Why? Alden pressed. Barron paused, considering his words carefully. Then, with the same quiet confidence he had shown earlier, he answered, Because I believe what we do when no one is watching matters more than what we do in the spotlight. Alden didn't respond immediately. He let the words settle. For a man who had spent his entire career under the scrutiny of the media, this perspective was different. Refreshing, even. You know, people look at me and see a man who's done it all, Alden said after a moment. But there are times I wonder if I've made enough of a difference where it really counts. Barron turned to face him fully. His expression wasn't one of awe or intimidation. It was of genuine curiosity. "I think you have," he said simply. "You inspire people, whether you mean to or not. Even now, sitting here, it means something." Alden studied him carefully. He had expected small talk. He had not expected this. The conversation shifted. What started as polite words turned into something deeper. They talked about legacy, power, success, and the weight that came with it. Alden shared stories about his youth, his struggles, the failures that shaped him. Barron, in turn, spoke about his desire to create his own path, away from the expectations that came with his name. Passengers around them listened quietly, pretending to be occupied with their books or in late entertainment. But it was obvious. Everyone was invested in this moment. Because something was happening here. Not just a conversation. A connection. A bridge between two generations, two worlds, two perspectives. Alden leaned back slightly, exhaling. "You know, kid, you might be onto something." Barron smirked. "About what?" Alden tapped the armrest lightly. "About what really matters." For the first time in a long time, Richard Alden wasn't thinking about numbers, power, or market trends. He was thinking about something much bigger. And as the plane continued soaring through the sky, he realized something he hadn't in years. It wasn't about where you sit. It was about who you sit with. The plane shook again, harder this time. A few passengers gasped. Alden tightened his grip on the seat. The storm was relentless, slamming against the aircraft like an unseen force, testing their resilience. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Barron. The boy was somewhere in the economy cabin now, experiencing the same storm but with far less comfort. Alden felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. And in that moment, he made a decision. The turbulence was not the only thing shifting tonight. The plane had finally stabilized and the once tense atmosphere was beginning to settle. The worst of the turbulence had passed, but a lingering unease remained among the passengers. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but everyone still felt the weight of what had just happened. Barron Trump remained in his economy seat, unfazed by the experience, while Richard Alden, one of the world's most powerful men, was deep in thought in the first-class seat that had originally belonged to the young man. Alden was not a man easily rattled. He had built an empire, shaped industries, and influenced global markets, yet something about this flight was different. It wasn't the turbulence. It was the boy. A 17-year-old who had, without hesitation, given up his comfort for an old man he barely knew. No negotiations, no expectations, just a simple, selfless act. And for some reason, Alden couldn't shake the feeling that this moment meant more than it appeared on the surface. Without thinking, he stood up. The movement caught the attention of the flight attendants, who immediately stepped forward, prepared to remind him to remain seated. But Alden wasn't concerned with protocol. With quiet determination, he walked past the first-class passengers, through the dividing curtain, and into economy. The contrast was stark. First class was an oasis of space and luxury, while economy was cramped, crowded, and noisy. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself drawn to this side of the plane. He stopped beside Barron's seat. The young man glanced up, surprised to see the billionaire standing in the narrow aisle. Alden gestured toward the open seat beside him. "Mind if I sit here for a while?" Barron blinked before offering a polite nod. "Of course, Mr. Alden." The surrounding passengers watched curiously. It wasn't every day that one of the richest men in America voluntarily left the comfort of first class to squeeze into coach. Alden lowered himself into the cramped seat, adjusting his posture as best he could. "Been a long time since I sat in the middle," he muttered with a smirk. Barron chuckled. "Not as bad as people think." Alden gave him a knowing glance. "That depends on the length of the flight." After a beat of silence, Alden finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that back there." Barron shrugged, his expression calm. It felt like the right thing to do. The answer was so simple, yet so powerful. Alden studied him, searching for any sign of a hidden motive, but there was none. This wasn't a calculated move or an attempt to impress anyone. It was genuine. "One?" Alden asked. Barron thought for a moment before replying. "Because I believe what we do when no one is watching matters more than what we do in the spotlight." Alden let the words sink in. A man who had spent his entire life in the public eye, constantly aware of how every decision would be scrutinized, suddenly found himself faced with a truth so simple yet profound. For decades, his success had been measured in numbers, in deals closed, in power accumulated. But sitting here, in this cramped economy seat, he began to wonder if he had been measuring the wrong things all along. "You know," Alden mused, his voice quieter now, "people look at me and see a man who's done it all. But there are times, I wonder, if I've made enough of a difference where it really counts." Barron turned toward him, his gaze thoughtful. "I think you have. You inspire people. Even now, sitting here, talking like this, it means something." Alden exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the tray table. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a polite conversation, maybe a few words of gratitude, but instead, he was having a discussion that felt more meaningful than any business meeting he had ever attended. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about legacy, about what truly mattered in the end. Alden shared stories of his past, of the risks he had taken, the moments that had defined him. Barron listened intently, occasionally offering his own perspective, one that was wise beyond his years. Passengers around them, who had initially tried to mind their own business, were now captivated. They pretended not to listen, but their stolen glances and slight shifts in posture betrayed their curiosity. This wasn't just a casual exchange between two strangers. This was something different, something rare. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. What had started as a routine flight had turned into something unforgettable, and neither Alden nor Barron realized just how far this moment would reach. As they stepped off the plane, a wave of murmurs followed them. The story of Barron's selfless act had spread among the passengers, and by the time they reached the terminal, it had already made its way to social media. A flight attendant had discreetly captured a photo of Alden and Barron sitting together, deep in conversation. The image, accompanied by the story of what had happened, quickly went viral. By the time they walked through the airport, reporters were already waiting. Flashing cameras, microphones held high, journalists eager to capture the moment. Alden glanced at Barron, amused. "You ready for this?" Barron smirked. "Not really." Alden chuckled. "Good. Means you're doing something worth talking about." A reporter called out first to Alden. "Mr. Alden, why did you leave first class to sit with Barron Trump?" Alden paused, then answered simply, "Because I realized that sometimes the most important conversations don't happen in first class. They happen in the places we least expect." Another reporter turned to Barron. "Barron, why did you give up your seat?" Barron shrugged, offering a small smile. "Because I could, and because I should." The response was so honest, so effortless, that it left the reporters momentarily stunned. No grand speech, no elaborate reasoning, just the truth. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. What neither of them realized was how far this story would go. Within hours, news outlets were covering it. The headlines ranged from Barron's selfless act to Alden's unexpected lesson in humility. Social media exploded with discussions about kindness, about what it meant to lead by example, about how small gestures could leave the biggest impact. And, in the middle of it all, two unlikely companions, one at the peak of his career, the other just beginning his own path, had found something priceless. Because in the end, it wasn't about money, power, or status. It was about a choice to be kind, a choice to listen, a choice to sit with someone even when you don't have to. And sometimes those choices change the world. The moment Barron and Richard Alden stepped out of the airport, the world had already taken notice. News of their interaction on the plane had spread at lightning speed. Social media was buzzing, flooded with reactions from people inspired by the story. A simple gesture, one young man offering his seat to an elderly billionaire, had somehow turned into a worldwide conversation about kindness, humility, and the unexpected power of human connection. By the next morning, major news outlets had picked up the story. Barron Trump's selfless act shocks billionaire Richard Alden was plastered across headlines. Talk shows dissected every detail, praising Barron's humility and Alden's decision to step into economy to continue their conversation. Commentators on both sides of the political spectrum seemed to agree on one thing: the world needed more moments like this. Barron's phone was flooded with messages. Friends, family, strangers, everyone wanted to share how much the story had moved them. His mother called, her voice full of warmth. "We're proud of you," she said simply. His father, never one for long emotional speeches, added, "You did good, son." But among the hundreds of messages, there was one that stood out, a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Barron, it's Richard Alden. Got a minute?" "Of course," Barron said, sitting up a little straighter. Alden's tone was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about our talk on the plane, about what really matters. There's a project I've been putting off for years, a film about kindness, about how the smallest actions can change lives. I think it's time to make it, and I want you involved." Barron was stunned. "Me? But I'm not an actor." "You don't have to be," Alden chuckled. "You've already inspired the story. I just need your perspective." Barron hesitated, still processing what was happening. Then he remembered something Alden had said on the plane. "It's not about where you sit. It's about who you sit with." "I'd be honored," Barron said at last. What had begun as a simple flight had turned into something much bigger. Within a week, Barron and Alden met in Alden's private studio, surrounded by stacks of notes and concept sketches. "Let's start from the beginning," Alden said. "What inspired you that day?" Barron thought for a moment before replying. "I guess I've always believed that small things matter. I've seen my parents do big things for the world, but I think kindness starts with the little things we do for each other." Alden nodded, jotting down notes. "That's the heart of it." As they worked, the story began to take shape. It wouldn't just be about Barron and Alden. It would be about the ripple effect of kindness, about how one action can inspire another and another until entire communities are changed. Months passed, and the project began to grow beyond what either of them had imagined. The more they talked, the more Alden realized that this wasn't just another film. It was a legacy. "I want this to be more than entertainment," he told Barron one evening as they sat in his office. "I want it to remind people what we're capable of when we choose compassion over indifference." The news of the project spread quickly. The world was fascinated by the unlikely collaboration between the legendary billionaire and the youngest Trump. As production started, people from all walks of life reached out, eager to be part of something meaningful. Schools began discussing the impact of kindness in their lessons. Nonprofits saw an increase in donations from people inspired by the story, and social media was filled with users sharing their own small acts of generosity, all using the hashtag #IT. One evening, Barron and Alden sat together watching the final cut of the film in an empty theater. As the last scene faded to black, Alden turned to Barron. "Well, kid, what do you think?" Barron, who had spent months working on the project, feeling the weight of its message, simply smiled. "I think we did something important." Alden nodded, his eyes reflecting something deeper than pride. "Yeah, we did." The premiere of the film was unlike anything Barron had ever experienced. The theater was packed with celebrities, critics, and everyday people who had been touched by the story before it even hit the screen. As the credits rolled, the audience sat in silence for a moment before erupting into applause. Alden stood, acknowledging the crowd before motioning for Barron to stand beside him. The room quieted as he spoke. "This young man reminded me why stories matter. He's the reason this film exists." Barron's face flushed, but he took a deep breath before stepping forward. "I've learned something through all of this," he said into the microphone. "Kindness isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility. And if we all choose kindness, the world changes, one small act at a time." The applause was deafening. The days following the premiere were a whirlwind. The film became an instant phenomenon, praised for its emotional depth and its ability to inspire real-world action. Stories poured in from around the globe, people forgiving old grudges, strangers helping strangers, communities coming together. But one message in particular stood out to Barron. It was a handwritten letter with no return address. "Dear Barron, I was on that flight the day you gave up your seat. I've struggled with my faith in people for a long time, but your act of kindness gave me hope again. It reminded me that there's still good in the world. Watching you and Mr. Alden connect inspired me to reconnect with my estranged son after 10 years. We're rebuilding what I thought was lost forever. Thank you for being an example of what humanity should be. You'll never know how much your actions meant to me. With gratitude, a fellow traveler." Barron read the letter twice, his vision blurring slightly. He had never met the person who wrote it, yet somehow, through one small action, he had changed their life. As he tucked the letter away in a safe place, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a movie. It wasn't just a story. It was proof that kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples that reach farther than we can ever imagine. A few weeks later, Barron and Alden sat on a bench overlooking the city. The gala's events were behind them, but the emotions still lingered. Barron exhaled, shaking his head. "I never thought a single moment on a plane could lead to all this." Alden chuckled. "Life's funny like that. Sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference." Barron gazed out at the skyline. "Do you think we've done enough?" Alden placed a hand on his shoulder. "Kid, it's not about doing enough. It's about starting something that keeps going." Barron smiled, finally understanding what Alden had been teaching him all along. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about planting seeds of kindness and letting them grow in the hearts of others. And as they sat in silence, Alden suddenly broke into a grin. "You know, we should probably tell people to keep this kindness thing going. Maybe invite them to join us." Barron laughed. "You mean like subscribe and comment?" "Exactly," Alden said with a wink. Barron turned to an imaginary camera. "If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments how you've been inspired to spread kindness. Let's keep the ripple going." And with that, two men from two different generations stood and walked away, not just as a billionaire and a young man, but as two people who had chosen to make the world a little kinder. As we wrap up this story, we want to remind you that the events and characters in this tale are purely fictional, crafted for entertainment and inspiration. But while the story itself may not be real, the message behind it certainly is. At its core, this story is about the power of kindness, humility, and human connection. It reminds us that no matter how different our backgrounds may be, the simple act of choosing kindness can bridge any gap. It's not about how much money you have, the titles you hold, or the privileges you're given. It's about how you use what you have to make the world a little better. A single act of selflessness, like giving up a seat, may seem small, but small actions create ripples. Ripples that can turn into waves, reaching further than we can ever imagine. Whether it's inspiring someone to reconnect with a loved one, reminding others to be compassionate, or simply changing the way we see the world, kindness always leaves an impact. So as you go about your day, remember that every choice matters. Choose to be kind, to listen, to show up for others, even when no one is watching. Because in the end, it's not about where you sit, but who you sit with. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.